"Can you take her instead of me?" whispered a little girl at the dusty market. And in that moment, the cowboy Jace Callahan made a choice that would change all their lives forever. From a stranger's silent decision to a story of family, trust, and love, reborn beneath the wide American sky. This is not just a tale, it's a journey of redemption. Where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below, I'd love to know. Wishing you a blessed and beautiful day. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next heart-stirring story. The summer sun of Kansas in 1874 blazed mercilessly over Dodge City, a place that had grown from a cattle stop into a frontier town where whiskey, dust, and danger walked hand in hand. The main street shimmered under the heat, wooden storefronts wavering in the haze. Wagon wheels clattered, horses stamped their hooves, and men in wide hats leaned on railings outside saloons, their laughter carried sharp in the air. Dodge lived on noise, and that noise was made of business, sweat, and sin. Toward the edge of town sprawled the livestock market, where cattle bawled in corrals, hogs squealed in pens, and in the darkest corners, human suffering was bartered with the same indifference as livestock. Through that dust walked Jace Callahan. At 35, he carried himself with the weight of years that had taught him survival but stripped away softness. Jace was tall 6'2", with the broad frame and muscle of a man forged by ranch labor. His chestnut hair, streaked faintly by sun, stayed hidden under a sweat-darkened hat. A faint scar traced the side of his jaw, a memory of a bar fight gone wrong. His eyes were a cold, weathered gray, eyes that did not seek company. The faint limp in his right leg, from a gunshot in a skirmish with rustlers years back, gave him a slow, deliberate gait. He was known in cattle country as a man who could break a horse quicker than most, mend a fence in half the time, and drink less whiskey than expected. His neighbors said he was reliable but distant, a man who carried tragedy in silence. They were right. The deaths of his brother and father, the slow wasting sickness of his sister, each loss carved into him until all that remained was grit and strength. Jace had buried tenderness alongside them, or so he told himself. That day he came to Dodge for horse medicine, quinine, and powders for a gelding's cough. He did not seek trouble, yet trouble often found men who wore silence like armor. At the gate to the market he heard a voice. "Callahan." He turned slightly. A woman stood there, her badge catching the sunlight. Sheriff Hannah Mercer, 32, tall, with auburn hair pulled into a bun that barely tamed the strands curling in the heat. She had eyes sharp as river glass, the kind that caught everything and forgave little. Her frame was lean, built not for beauty but endurance, her stance wide as though she refused to ever be knocked off her feet again. Jace had once known her laughter years ago, before her father's death, and his absence drove a wedge too deep to repair. Now her voice carried authority edged with something colder. "You don't want to walk that far down, Callahan," she said, nodding toward the shadowed corrals. "These markets eat men alive. Walk on." Jace met her gaze but did not answer. He only tipped his hat a fraction and kept walking. Hannah exhaled sharply, muttered something under her breath, and turned back to the deputy at her side. She had warned him. That was all she owed. Jace's boots struck the dust as he passed pens of cattle. But it wasn't cattle that filled the farthest corrals. There, in the shade, sat women immigrants mostly, wrists bound, eyes sunken from hunger. Some leaned against the rails with the slackness of those already half gone. A few children clung to skirts that barely held together. Voices cracked in languages Jace did not know, but the tone pleading, fading needed no translation. He kept his eyes forward. A man could not carry every sorrow. He had no business here. Then something tugged at the hem of his duster. He stopped, looked down. A little girl stood barefoot in the dirt. She could not have been older than 4. Her hair was black and tangled, falling over a sunburned face. A thin cotton dress clung to her small frame, torn at the seams. Bruises darkened her knees, her legs thin as sticks. Her eyes, wide and brown, looked up at him, too heavy with fear for such a small body. "Don't take me," she whispered, her words halting, broken by accent. "Take my mama." Her name, he would soon learn, was Marisol Vega. Jace bent slightly, his hat shadowing his face. "Your mama?" She nodded quickly, clutching his coat with both hands, as though letting go would mean losing her last chance. "There," she said, pointing with a trembling finger. Her English stumbled. "Mama. Sick. No eat. 2 days. They say take her. Bad place. Jace followed her gesture. In the far corner, slumped against a cracked post, sat a woman. She looked no older than her late 20s. Isabella Vega, Marisol's mother. Her skin, olive beneath the grime, had gone pale with fever. A bruise closed one eye, her lip was split, and her jaw bore the swollen mark of a blow. Ropes cut into her wrists, raw and bleeding, forcing her arms overhead. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising weakly, each movement as though dragged from her unwilling body. Yet one hand, trembling and barely strong enough, angled protectively toward the girl even in unconsciousness. Marisol's small voice wavered. I give her bread, all mine, 2 days. She's still not wake. Jace stared at the girl's eyes, and in them he saw something that reached past dust and time, his sister's face when she was a child, begging him not to leave her side the night their father came home drunk. He had not been able to save her then. The memory bit deep. This time, his boots did not move forward. They turned. The slaver sat nearby, fat and sweating in the sun. His name was Silas Kruger, a man with German drawl and pale, snake-like eyes. He tapped a fly switch against his thigh and smirked. You looking to buy, mister? His teeth were yellow, his vest stained with grease. Jace said nothing at first. He reached into his coat, pulled a leather pouch, and dropped it onto the rough table. Coins spilled with a sharp clink. I'll take both. Kruger blinked. Both? Woman's half dead and the girl's worse than a stray pup. You just bought yourself trouble, cowboy. From the crowd came jeers. A cattle drover laughed. Callahan's gone soft, another spat. Ain't worth the coin. A drunk barkeep shouted, best bury him now. A few voices muttered prayers under breath. One old woman shook her head, pity in her eyes. Jace ignored them. His gaze stayed fixed on Kruger. The girl comes too. Kruger snorted, then swept the coins into his hand. Fine. They're yours. Don't say I didn't warn you. Jace turned his back without another word. He bent, scooped Marisol into his arms. She curled into his neck instantly, silent, clinging as though she had always belonged there. Then, careful as glass, he cut Isabella down. Her body sagged heavy in his arms, weightless, yet burdened with suffering. The crowd that had mocked him fell quiet, the laughter fading into something else, a silence tinged with disbelief. Boots scraped, spurs jangled, but no one stepped forward. Marisol's whisper broke it. Gracias. Thank you. For Mama. Jace did not answer. He only held them tighter as he strode out of the corral, through the dust and the searing light of Dodge City. Behind him jeers rose faintly again, but they sounded small against the weight of what he carried. His path that day had been chosen not by him, but by a child's plea, and though he did not yet know it, nothing about his life would ever walk the same road again. The road from Dodge stretched long and lonesome, carrying the weight of silence that neither the child nor the cowboy cared to break. The sun sagged toward the west, a red coin sinking into the plains, while cicadas began their shrill chorus among the cottonwoods. Jace Callahan rode steady, his muscled frame pressed against the saddle horn, one arm supporting little Marisol Vega, who clung to him as though letting go would mean falling into darkness itself. Behind them, lashed carefully across a saddle blanket, lay Isabella Vega mother, prisoner, survivor, her body limp, her breathing shallow, fever's fire licking at her skin. By the time they reached Jace's cabin at the edge of a creek bend, night had come, heavy with the smell of dust and wild sage, and the only sound was the creek's steady murmur against stone. The cabin itself was rough-hewn pine and cedar, built by Jace's own hands years earlier, when he thought the world might still hold promise. Its roofline sloped against the stars, the windows small, the chimney still carrying the faint perfume of old wood smoke. Once the place had carried laughter, the kind only a child's voice could make, but that was before death and silence settled in like permanent tenants. Now, with 2 strangers in his care, the cabin seemed to draw a different breath, as though the ghosts inside shifted to make room. He carried Isabella into the back room. It had been his sister's once, painted in pale blue, with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed and toys carved of wood still resting on the sill. The sight struck him like a hammer, but he forced his face blank as he lowered the woman onto the mattress. Marisol climbed up beside her, stroking her mother's tangled hair, whispering in Spanish words Jace couldn't understand, but whose pleading tone burned clear. Jace lit a lamp, fetched water from the pump, and stirred willow bark into a tin cup with honey to blunt the bitterness. His hands, rough with rope burns and calluses, moved with surprising gentleness as he laid cloths across Isabella's brow. He guided Marisol's little fingers, showing her how to wring a rag, how to dab the sweat from her mother's temples. The girl's eyes shone in the lamplight, wide with fear, but she mimicked his motions faithfully, whispering, "Wake up, Mama. Please wake." Hours stretched into days. Isabella hovered in the half-light of fever, her body racked by chills, lips murmuring words broken by delirium. Marisol rarely left her side, curling against her mother at night like a small guardian. Jace kept watch from the chair by the door, boots still on, rifle propped within reach, a man carved into stillness. At moments, his gaze wandered to the toys on the sill or the shoes tucked beneath the bed, memories clawing back of his sister's slow death and the helpless boy he had been then. Now he sat as a man, determined not to watch another life slip away without fight. On the third morning, as dawn spilled gold across the window, Isabella stirred. Her lids fluttered, and at last her eyes cracked open, dark and glassy with confusion. Her lips parted, drawing a ragged breath. Jace leaned forward, careful not to startle. "Easy," he said low, steady as iron. "You're safe." But safety was not a word her bones remembered. Her gaze landed on him, and terror sparked. She tried to push herself upright, though her limbs shook violently, and whispered hoarsely, "No, don't stay away!" Her voice fractured, but panic gave it strength. Marisol bolted awake, clutching her mother. "Mama, no! He help, the girl cried, tears flooding her wide eyes. She grabbed Isabella's wrists with her tiny hands, pressing them down against the quilt as if to keep her from striking. "He make you better. He fix your hurts." Isabella's breathing quickened, her chest rising too fast, eyes darting between her daughter and the tall cowboy framed in shadow. Jace took one slow step back, palms open, lowering himself slightly to ease his height. "I'm not here to harm you," he said softly, "only to keep you both alive." But his words reached only halfway. Mistrust had carved itself deep in her. The tension hung thick until the sound of hooves broke it. Jace straightened, instinct pulling his hand toward the colt at his hip. From the porch came the crunch of boots and the creak of leather. He pushed the door open a crack, his gray eyes narrowing. Sheriff Hannah Mercer sat astride her chestnut mare, her auburn hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, dust coating the hem of her long duster. 32 and tall, Hannah carried herself with the rigid strength of a woman who had fought to be taken seriously in a town where law was often a man's word and a gun's bark. Her features were stern, but not unkind, her green eyes sharp as cut glass, and beneath that iron lay the faintest echo of the girl she had once been before grief made her steel. She swung down from the saddle with fluid ease, tied her reins to the rail, and stepped up onto the porch, her badge glinting in the light. Her hand hovered near her revolver, a sheriff's habit, but she kept her voice even. "Heard you stirred the dust in Dodge, Callahan. Folks say you threw gold at Kruger and carried off his merchandise. You aiming to run a charity out here?" Jace's jaw flexed, but his tone stayed level. "I didn't buy them. I pulled them out of hell." Hannah gave a short, sharp laugh that held no mirth. "That's not how men like Kruger will see it. You made him look a fool in front of half the market. He'll want blood." Her eyes narrowed. "And since when did you start risking your hide for strangers? The Jace Callahan I knew never lifted a hand unless there was something in it for him." His gaze cut to hers, and for a moment the air between them thickened with the unspoken weight of years. Finally he said, voice gravel low, "People change." Her lips pressed thin. "Not all people, not always for the better. You proved that the day you rode out instead of standing beside me when my father lay dying." The words hit like a lash, pulling the old wound wide. Jace's throat worked, but no answer came. He turned away, staring out at the cottonwoods instead. Before either could speak again, a cry rang from the back room. Isabella's voice, broken but fierce, cut through the cabin. Jace moved first, Hannah at his heels, her hand reflexively on the butt of her Colt. They stepped into the room to find Isabella half risen, her back against the headboard, clutching Marisol tight, eyes blazing like a cornered animal. "Stay away," she rasped, her voice rough but louder now, terror burning away weakness. Hannah froze, hands lifted slightly, palms out. "Easy," she said softly, her lawman's instincts tempered by the sight before her. "No one's here to hurt you." Marisol sobbed against her mother's chest, tugging at her sleeve. "Mama, he help, he fix you. He give food, he safe." Her words tumbled out, frantic, her small hands patting her mother's face as if to ground her in truth. Isabella's chest heaved, her gaze flicking between the child's desperate eyes and the silent cowboy by the door. The fight in her faltered, shoulders trembling with exhaustion, though mistrust still lined every breath. Jace did not move closer. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, letting the weight of stillness speak. He had learned long ago that sometimes words only deepened wounds. Hannah, standing nearby, studied him with a mix of irritation and something she would never admit: respect. For all his faults, Jace Callahan could hold steady when storms rose. Finally, Isabella sagged back against the pillow, clutching Marisol but no longer shouting. Her eyes, still wary, never left Jace. Hannah adjusted her hat, breaking the silence. "You've got yourself a storm brewing, Callahan. You'd better be ready when it hits." Jace's answer was simple, low. "I've been through worse." She gave a small, humorless smile, then turned on her heel, boots striking the floor hard as she strode out. Moments later, the sound of hooves faded down the trail, leaving the cabin quiet again. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled softly. Isabella clung to her daughter, her eyes filled with doubt, but no longer pure terror. Jace stood in the doorway, shadowed, watching the fragile shape of trust begin to form, not yet steady, but there, like the first glimmer of dawn after a long storm. The day broke heavy with clouds over the Kansas plains, the air thick with the smell of wet dust, though no rain had fallen. A restless wind rattled the cottonwoods that circled Jace Callahan's cabin, carrying with it the sound of horses shifting in the corral and the groan of wood as the porch boards gave under his boots. He had risen before dawn, as he always did, and tended the stock with quiet hands, but there was no mistaking the tension inside those log walls. Isabella Vega had begun to stir with more strength, and strength brought not gratitude, but suspicion. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, willow bark, and boiled oats. The blue-walled bedroom that had once belonged to Jace's sister still held its ghost-scuffed shoes beneath the bed, toys lined carefully on the windowsill, but now it carried the faint hum of life again. Isabella sat propped against pillows, her black hair loose and tangled around her shoulders, her olive skin pale, but her eyes dark and alive. She looked healthier than 3 days earlier, yet the new fire in her eyes was not warmth but defiance. Marisol, the little girl, sat at her mother's feet, tracing shapes in the quilt with her finger, her small face earnest and watchful. When Jace entered carrying a basin of fresh water, his tall frame filled the doorway. He wore his work shirt rolled at the sleeves, sweat darkening the cloth at his chest, the muscles of his forearms corded and scarred by years of labor. His gray eyes were calm but unreadable, his jaw tight from silence. He set the basin down on the wooden table, wrung out a cloth, and stepped toward the bed to change the dressing on Isabella's wrist. That was when she moved. Her hand shot out, trembling but desperate, and seized the wooden brush Marisol had dropped to the floor the night before. With a sudden cry, she swung it at him, her voice cracking with fury. The brush struck his shoulder once, twice, her arms shaking with the effort. "You bought me!" she rasped, her accent thickening with rage. "You think I'm yours now? Just another thing on your land?" Her eyes blazed as she tried to lift the brush again, but her strength faltered and the weapon slipped from her grasp, clattering against the floorboards. Jace did not raise his hand, did not flinch even when the blows landed. He stood still, his broad chest rising slow and steady, his gaze fixed on hers. For a moment pain flickered in his gray eyes, not from the strikes but from something deeper, a memory of all he had lost. He let her words settle in the space between them, then shook his head slowly. His answer was a single word, firm and quiet. "No." He turned then, his boots striking heavy against the planks as he left the room, the door creaking shut behind him. Isabella sagged back against the pillows, her chest heaving, her throat tight with shame that mixed with fear until she trembled. Her daughter stirred at the commotion, blinking wide brown eyes and pushing herself into her mother's arms. "Mama?" Marisol whispered, her voice high with worry. She laid her small hands on Isabella's cheeks as if to steady her. "He not bad. He sleep outside." Isabella frowned, confused, her breath ragged. What do you mean? The child's eyes filled with tears, her words tumbling out in broken English. He cook, he make soup, he fix your hands, but he sleep on floor by door, every night. I see. Her fingers clutched at her mother's wrist with fierce sincerity, the kind that could not lie. Isabella's gaze flicked toward the doorway, and for the first time she noticed the folded blanket and pillow resting near the threshold, tucked neatly against the wall. She had thought his distance meant indifference. Now she realized it was restraint. Her throat tightened, but words failed her, and she pulled her daughter close, burying her face in the child's tangled hair. The rest of the day passed in uneasy rhythm. Jace stayed mostly outside, splitting wood and mending fence lines, the sweat on his broad back glistening in the noon sun. Isabella watched from the window as Marisol dozed against her lap, the steady sound of Jace's axe splitting logs echoing across the yard. Every strike reminded her of the man she had called a buyer, and each time she found her breath catching in confusion she did not want to name. Late in the afternoon, the air shifted. From far off came the faint thud of hooves and the rising dust of a rider. Jace noticed first, straightening from his work, the axe dropping into the stump. His hand brushed the butt of the colt at his hip, gray eyes narrowing as the figure drew nearer. The rider came into view astride a glossy bay stallion too polished for real labor. He was a man in his 40s, thick at the waist but broad-shouldered, his hair thinning and pale, his skin ruddy from whiskey and sun. He wore a fine wool vest over his shirt and boots that gleamed with polish, and his pale eyes carried the arrogance of one who believed the world for sale. This was Eli Dawson, owner of the ranch 2 ridges over, a man who had clawed his way from poverty by ruthless trade until wealth made him cruel. His smile was a practiced thing, sharp and mean beneath the appearance of charm. "Callahan," Dawson drawled as he swung down from the saddle, his boots striking dust. "Heard about your little purchase in Dodge. Thought I'd ride over and make you an offer before you get wise enough to regret it." Jace's shoulders squared. "Not for sale." Dawson chuckled, patting the neck of his pampered stallion. "Everything's for sale, friend. That woman Isabella, isn't it? She won't last long out here with you. Best let a man with means take her off your hands. I'll pay double what you spent, and throw in something extra if you rid yourself of the child." The words struck the cabin like a hammer. From the doorway, Isabella's breath hitched. She clutched Marisol to her chest, her heart pounding, her worst fears roaring back. Jace did not look at her, but he knew she was listening. His voice came low and hard. "I said no." Dawson stepped closer, his pale eyes narrowing. "Don't play stubborn, Callahan. You've been alone too long to fool me. You can't keep her. You'll tire of her soon enough. Let me take her now before it costs you more than coin." Jace's jaw tightened, his hand resting near his Colt, though he did not draw it. The wind shifted, stirring dust between them. "You need to leave," he said evenly. For a long moment Dawson stared, his lips curling into a sneer. Then he spat into the dirt, swung into his saddle, and leaned down with a mocking grin. "You'll regret this. Men like me don't walk away empty-handed." With that, he jerked the reins, the bay stallion rearing before charging off in a spray of dust. Silence fell heavy again over the yard. Jace stood motionless, fists clenched, his chest rising slow with measured breath. In the doorway, Isabella trembled, her dark eyes locked on him. Suspicion still lingered, but something else had sparked beneath it, a fragile awareness of the man who had stood firm against the world's cruelty, even when she had raised her hand against him. Marisol pressed her small face into her mother's neck and whispered with childish certainty, "See, Mama? He protect." Isabella swallowed hard, her voice faint, almost to herself. "He said no." Her fingers tightened around the child as she whispered again, as though testing the words for truth. "He said no." Neither she nor Jace spoke further, but the silence between them had shifted. It was no longer only mistrust. It was the first crack of light through a door long shut, a fragile step towards something not yet trust, but no longer pure fear. The morning after Dawson's visit broke under a restless sky. Clouds sagged heavy and low, smearing gray across the plains, and the cottonwoods that ringed Jace Callahan's cabin shifted with uneasy whispers as though they knew something sharp was drawing near. Jace moved about the yard with practiced rhythm, his tall frame cutting through the mist, muscles flexing as he stacked firewood and checked the corral. His arm ached from the work of the past days, but he pushed the pain down. Inside the cabin, Isabella Vega stood at the window, Marisol pressed close against her leg, the child's eyes wide and watchful. Isabella's own gaze was caught between suspicion and something quieter, the memory of Jace's refusal to hand her over still weighing against the doubts that clung stubbornly to her heart. The silence broke first with the sound of hooves. Jace stiffened, his gray eyes snapping toward the trail. Dust curled over the ridge in a slow, gathering plume, the rhythm of riders beating steady as a war drum. He stepped quickly to the porch, the Winchester in his hands before he realized he had moved. "Inside," he ordered, voice low but firm. Isabella did not argue, her pulse hammering as she pulled Marisol back into the cabin, pressing the girl against her chest while Jace shut the door with a hard slam. The riders came into view one by one. 4 men in trail-worn dusters, their faces hard with the marks of violence and weather. The leader was narrow, his cheek carved by a scar that pulled his lip into a sneer. Another was thick through the shoulders, his beard ragged, his revolver gleaming. A third kept his hat low, the edge shadowing eyes that glittered with mischief, twin pistols at his hips. The last was young, barely more than a boy, his colt bay horse tossing its head nervously as though resisting the errand it had been forced into. Behind them, still astride his polished stallion, rode Eli Dawson, watching from a distance, his pale eyes narrowing with amusement. He did not ride to the front. He never did his own dirty work. The scarred rider drew up just shy of the porch. "Callahan," he shouted, voice sharp against the morning air. "Boss says you're holding what's his. Best hand her over before we take it ourselves." Jace's answer was as cold as stone. "No one here belongs to him. Ride back while you can." The rider laughed, spitting into the dirt. "Suit yourself." He jerked his chin, and a rifle cracked. The shot tore into the porch rail inches from Jace's chest, splinters flying. Jace dove behind the post, the Winchester barking in return. His shot struck true, catching the heavy-set rider across the arm, sending him tumbling sideways in his saddle before he fell to the ground with a curse. Chaos exploded. Gunfire ripped through the yard, bullets smacking wood and earth. Horses screamed, dust churned, and the air thickened with smoke. Jace moved with the sharp reflex of a man who had fought for his life before, using the porch as cover, shifting from one post to the next. He fired carefully, never wasting a bullet, his broad shoulders steady even as pain seared across his upper arm when a shot grazed him. Blood slicked his sleeve, hot and wet. But he gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, switching the rifle to his left hand. Inside, Isabella clutched Marisol tight, her body rigid with fear as bullets thudded into the walls. The child whimpered, whispering into her mother's dress, "Mama, don't let them take him." Isabella's breath caught at the words. Against all reason, she looked through the shutter's crack and saw him, tall, defiant, bleeding yet refusing to fall. Something inside her shifted, fear tangled with awe, and for the first time she saw not a captor but a shield. The scarred man cursed, firing again, only to jerk when Jace's bullet shattered the ground at his horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming, nearly throwing its rider. The young one panicked, tugging at his reins, his bay bolting sideways until the boy tumbled into the dirt, scrambling away with terror bright in his eyes. Another shot from Jace's Winchester rang out, and the pistol-armed rider staggered, clutching his shoulder, his grin wiped clean. From the ridge, Dawson lifted a hand. He had seen enough. One man defending a cabin had bloodied his crew and stood unbroken despite the wound. He would not waste more men, not with the sheriff rumored to patrol the valley. He whistled, sharp and low, and the surviving riders pulled back, cursing, hauling the wounded heavy-set man into a saddle as they retreated. Dawson lingered only a moment, his pale gaze fixed on Jace with cold promise, before he turned his stallion and vanished into the dust. Silence bled back into the yard. Jace lowered the Winchester, breath ragged, his arm soaked red. He took one step toward the porch before his legs gave out, his broad frame collapsing against the rail. The rifle slipped from his hand with a dull thud. Isabella burst from the cabin then, ignoring her own weakness as she rushed across the yard. She caught his weight just as his knees threatened to buckle, nearly staggering under the heaviness of him. "Sit," she ordered, her voice trembling but fierce. She guided him to the porch steps, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound. "Stay awake, do you hear me? Stay." Jace tried to speak but only managed a grunt. His eyes fluttered, but they stayed on her, steady even in pain. Marisol appeared at her mother's side with a bucket of water. her small hands white-knuckled around the handle. "Here, Mama," she said, voice breaking. The child had fetched it without being asked, her courage rising where fear had nearly undone her. Isabella's heart clenched, but she forced her hands to work. She tore strips from her skirt, pouring whiskey over the torn flesh, even as Jace hissed with the burn. "Foolish man," she whispered, her accent thick, tears slipping down her cheek. "You fight for us. You bleed for us. Let me fix you." Her fingers bound the wound tight, her palms stained crimson, her breath ragged as she pressed the cloth firm. Marisol clutched Jace's hand, whispering, "Don't go, please." Jace managed a faint squeeze, his jaw tightening as pain racked him, but he did not let go. When the worst was bound, Isabella sat back, her hands trembling. She looked into his eyes, still gray and steady despite the blood. Something cracked open inside her chest, a place that had been locked tight since the first man ever raised a hand against her. Her voice dropped, almost to herself. "Maybe you are not like them." From the ridge, another set of eyes had been watching. Sheriff Hannah Mercer sat her chestnut mare in the shelter of the trees, her duster dark with dust from the trail. She had followed Dawson's riders, suspicion pulling her forward, but had held back when the first shots rang. Her hand had hovered near her revolver, ready to intervene, but she stopped when she saw Jace stand alone, fighting not for himself, but for the woman and child inside that cabin. Now she watched as Isabella's trembling hands tended his wound, as Marisol pressed close against his side. Hannah's throat tightened. Once, Jace had been hers, though neither had spoken the words. But time had passed, and loss had carved them apart. She saw now where his heart had gone, stitched not to the past, but to this fragile family that clung to him as anchor and savior. Her lips pressed thin, her green eyes shining for just a moment before she turned her mare slowly away. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the rustle of cottonwoods and the low murmur of a creek that had seen too much sorrow and yet carried on. On the porch, Jace leaned back against the post, his shirt torn, his breath shallow. Isabella's hands still pressed against his wound, Marisol curled against his side. Pain throbbed through him, but there was something else in his chest, a weight, not of hurt but of belonging. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb for ghosts. It felt like shelter, fragile and fierce, chosen and real. The days after the fight carried a stillness that felt different from the silence before. The cottonwoods still whispered in the evening wind. The creek still moved slow and steady behind the cabin. But now those sounds carried a weight of survival, of lives that had refused to be taken. Jace Callahan moved through the days with his arm bound tight, the wound still raw. He was not the man of tireless strength he had once been. Each step held effort, each chore demanded pauses, yet he kept to his work. His tall frame still rose at dawn, shoulders squared, but now his hand sometimes gripped the porch rail for balance, and when he swung the axe into wood it was fewer times before resting. Inside, Isabella Vega watched him, her dark eyes narrowing not in suspicion alone, but in a searching kind of study. She had seen him bleed for her and her daughter, had felt the weight of his body near collapse as she bound the wound with shaking hands. That memory did not vanish easily. Still, fear did not fade all at once, and her trust came slow. She cleaned the cabin one corner at a time, sweeping dust into the hearth, washing old cloth in the basin, her movements hesitant but determined. At first she did not step past the porch, keeping herself near the door, but in the afternoons she began to sweep the yard, then kneel to gather weeds near the fence. Each small action was both work and a test, a way of seeing if the ground beneath her feet could truly belong to her again. Marisol was everywhere, small and bright, trailing her mother or Jace depending on who would let her tag along. She was quick to fetch water when Jace's arm slowed him, proud to stir a pot of beans with a wooden spoon nearly as long as her arm, delighted to brush the mare's mane with clumsy strokes. She still cried out at night, clutching at her mother when dreams carried her back to the pens, but in the morning her laughter rang louder than her fears. Her voice became the thread that pulled the three of them together. One morning Jace tried to haul a bucket of water from the well, his breath hissing through his teeth when the rope burned against his injured arm. Before he could grit through it, Marisol darted forward, her small hands clutching the rope, her legs braced through the bucket nearly toppled her. Jace bent quickly, steadying both her and the water, his lips quirking in the faintest of smiles. "You're stronger than you look, little bird," he said softly. Isabella had watched from the doorway, her heart pounding at the sight. She had expected him to scold, to bark at the girl for trying, but instead he crouched to her level, ruffling her tangled hair gently before helping her pour the water into a basin. Later that day, Jace saddled his mare to exercise her along the creek. Marisol skipped beside him, her hand clutching his, her face bright with anticipation. Isabella felt her chest tighten but followed at a distance, her steps slow. Jace lifted Marisol into the saddle, steadying her small frame with his good arm, and showed her how to hold the reins. The mare, a steady bay with calm eyes, moved at a careful walk along the water's edge. Jace walked beside, murmuring instructions, his gaze steady on the child. It was then, as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods and lit the creek in gold, that Marisol turned her face toward him. Her eyes shone with trust, her small voice ringing clear. "Papa," she said. The word froze him where he stood. His breath caught, his chest tight as if struck by something unseen. For a moment, he saw his own daughter's face. The smile he had buried with her years ago, and pain surged sharp and deep. But then he looked at Marisol, her laughter rising, her small hands gripping the reins as though nothing in the world could shake her faith in him. He lifted her down, setting her carefully on the ground, and without a word he pulled her against his chest. She pressed her cheek into his shirt, and though his throat burned with silence, his arms answered for him. Isabella had seen it all. From where she stood, she pressed her hand over her mouth, her knees weakening with the weight of what she witnessed. For so long she had believed no man could be trusted, that every smile carried a trap. But here was her daughter giving the most sacred word to a man who had spilled his own blood to keep them safe. Tears blurred her vision, her breath shuddering as she turned back toward the cabin, not out of fear this time, but because her heart could no longer hold steady. That night, after Marisol had curled into sleep with her small hand still clutching the edge of Jace's shirt, Isabella sat by the hearth. She stared into the flames for a long time before speaking, her voice halting but steady enough. "She never call anyone that," she whispered. Not once." Jace sat opposite her, his wounded arm resting against his knee, his face shadowed by firelight, his gray eyes lifted slowly to meet hers. "I didn't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't need words," Isabella said quietly. Her gaze lingered, trembling but unbroken. "She choose, and maybe I can choose too." The days that followed were not free of fear, but they carried something new alongside it. Isabella began to plant a small patch of beans near the porch, her hands working the soil though her body still carried bruises. Marisol dug beside her, laughing each time she found a worm wriggling in the dirt. Jace mended a gate with one hand, sweat running down his temples, but when he faltered, Isabella stepped forward to hold the post steady without being asked. Their lives moved not in great leaps but in quiet, stubborn steps, each action stitching them closer into something whole. One evening they shared a meal of cornbread and beans at the rough table. Marisol, with charcoal in hand, drew a picture on a scrap of paper. 3 figures holding hands beneath a sun, smiling. She held it up proudly, eyes bright. "Mama, Papa, me," she declared. Isabella's breath faltered, tears welling as she stroked her daughter's hair. "Familia," she whispered in Spanish, the word catching but warm. Jace said nothing, only reached to rest his hand near hers on the table. When their fingers brushed, neither pulled away. The cabin's silence that night felt different, less like walls holding sorrow and more like the breath of a home reborn. When morning came again, it carried with it not only chores and aches, but a fragile, unspoken bond. The cottonwoods still swayed in the wind, the creek still whispered its endless song, but now there was laughter at dawn and the promise of more than survival. For the first time in years, Jace Callahan could almost believe the word family might belong to him again. Spring lingered across the plains with a softness that almost seemed impossible after the storms of winter and blood. The cottonwoods swayed with new leaves, the creek brimmed full and sang through the valley, and every dawn came with the scent of earth stirring back to life. Weeks had turned into months since the day Marisol first called Jace Papa, and in that time the cabin had become something more than a shelter. The place no longer whispered only of sorrow, but of bread baking on the hearth, of a little girl's laughter, and of a woman learning to move again without fear. Jace's wound healed slowly, leaving his arms stiff at times, but he worked as much as his strength allowed. He mended the corral fence plank by plank, patched the roof before the spring rains, and guided the horses to pasture when the grass pushed through. Where once he labored in solitude, now Isabella worked beside him, her hands pulling weeds from the garden she had planted near the porch, her dark hair tied back, her dress patched but clean. Marisol darted between them like sunlight, carrying water, chattering about chicks hatching in the coop, or racing barefoot to the creek where she returned dripping and grinning. It was in that rhythm that the talk of marriage arose, not as a dramatic vow, but as a steady truth. One evening, as dusk poured lavender light over the cabin, Jace set aside the tools he had been sharpening and looked across the table at Isabella. His gray eyes, worn but sure, lingered on her face. "You and the girl have made this place more alive than I thought it ever could be again," he said quietly. "If you'll have me, I'd like to make it right, for all of us." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Isabella stared into the fire before turning back to him. Her lips trembled as old memories pressed against her ribs, the faces of men who had only ever seen her as possession. Yet here was a man who bled for her, who never stepped into her room without knocking, who held her daughter with care. She drew a breath and whispered a single word that shook with emotion, but did not falter. Yes. The wedding was simple, fitting for a land where survival left little space for grandeur. Jace rode into Silver Bend to ask the old preacher, Reverend Abernathy, a wiry man with snow-white hair and a back bent by years, but a voice still strong with scripture. The Reverend remembered Jace from lean winters and agreed without question, hitching his mule to a weathered buggy. Neighbors who had long respected Jace for his labor and his quiet honor came carrying gifts of cornbread, smoked meat, and jars of wildflowers. Some had helped patch his roof after a storm, others had traded cattle feed in hard seasons. Their presence made sense. They came because they understood what it meant for a man once broken to find something worth standing for again. On the morning of the ceremony, the yard outside the cabin was swept clean. Isabella wore a white cotton dress she had stitched herself, the hem uneven where her hands had hurried, but her hair was braided with wildflowers gathered by Marisol. Jace stood tall in a freshly laundered shirt, his dark hair combed for the first time in months, his broad shoulders carrying a quiet gravity. Marisol was radiant in a patched frock tied with ribbon. She carried a basket filled with blossoms she had plucked along the creek. Her cheeks flushed as she twirled and scattered petals with uncontained joy. "Mama? Papa? Look!" she cried, her voice carrying like birdsong. Jace's hand instinctively rested on her head as she passed, steadying her when she tripped on the edge of her skirt, his lips tugging into a rare smile. The preacher began with words worn by time yet still powerful. As Jace repeated the vows, his deep voice roughened, the memories of loss rising behind his ribs, but his eyes never left Isabella's. She trembled when her turn came, her voice halting as she spoke the words, and for a moment her past threatened to choke her. But then she looked into his face, saw the man who had never taken more than freely given, and her voice steadied. She repeated every vow, her accent thick but her conviction unbroken. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Jace bent his head, and their kiss was reverent, quiet, and whole. The neighbors clapped softly, some wiping eyes, while Marisol squealed with delight and flung her last handful of flowers into the air. At a distance, Sheriff Hannah Mercer sat on her chestnut mare beneath the shadow of the cottonwoods. She had not dismounted, nor had she joined the circle of celebration, but her green eyes watched every moment. She had once dreamed of another path with Jace Callahan, and for a time the thought of it had lingered like a thorn, but as she watched him now, standing beside Isabella with the child laughing at their feet, she felt only clarity. Her hand brushed the badge at her chest, then fell, and she whispered a simple benediction into the wind, "Be happy, Jace." Then she turned her mare, tipping her hat low, and rode away into the open plain without looking back. The feast that followed was modest but full of warmth. They ate cornbread and beans, laughter spilling as neighbors swapped stories, and children chased each other through the grass. Marisol danced barefoot, her basket bouncing in her arms, her voice carrying high above the crowd. For the first time in years, Isabella laughed freely, her head thrown back, the sound like water breaking through stone. Jace stood at her side, one arm slipping around her waist, steady as a promise. When the last of the neighbors had gone and the preacher's buggy had rattled down the trail, The family retreated inside. The cabin glowed with lamplight, shadows flickering across walls scrubbed clean by Isabella's hands. Marisol knelt near the hearth with a sheet of paper clutched in her fingers, her tongue between her teeth as she carefully scrawled uneven letters. Jace had guided her hand, spelling each letter slowly until the word stood finished beneath the drawing she had made of 3 figures holding hands. With a proud grin, she pinned it to the wall above the fire. The drawing was simple: Mama, Papa, and Marisol beneath a wide sun, each figure marked with a small heart. And beneath it, though the letters leaned crooked and uneven, one word glowed truer than any vow spoken aloud: home. Isabella's eyes filled as she traced the edge of the paper, her dark hair brushing Jace's shoulder. She whispered in Spanish, "Al fin." At last. Jace's hand found hers, rough and scarred but warm, and together they stood in silence, the fire crackling, their daughter's laughter carrying from the bed where she curled beneath a quilt. For years the cabin had been only a monument to grief, but tonight it breathed with life. It held love, trust, and the fragile, fierce hope of a family remade. And in that single word above the hearth, all of it found its name: home. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or lightning. They come quietly, in the form of a child's smile, a second chance at trust, or the courage to believe again after years of loss. This story reminds us that God's hand works not only in grand moments, but also in the simple rhythms of daily life: a family meal, a helping hand, a word of love spoken at the right time. Just as Jace, Isabella, and Marisol found their home through faith and grace, we too can find hope in the ordinary days when we open our hearts to God's guidance. May this story encourage you to look for His miracles in your own life. If this touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us your thoughts. And if you believe in God's power to restore what was once broken, type Amen below. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the love that heals and the grace that carries us through. May the Lord bless you and keep you always.